Truth wrapped in a difficult sentence. There are some titles that make the soul bristle, some ideas that shake the comfort of our intellect, and others that dare to pierce through the armor of social niceties to get to something raw, uncomfortable perhaps, but necessary. This is one of them. Proof all narcissistic men are psychologically gay. I ask you not to flinch, not because the phrase is polite, it is not, but because the truth it dares to reveal is not about sexuality as the world defines it, but about psychological identity, repression, and the lost art of being real. The words may sound like accusation, but what follows is an invitation, not to condemn, but to understand, not to shame, but to uncover, not to mock, but to unmask. We do not speak today of orientation. We speak of orientation of identity, of emotional energy, of unconscious fixation, and of a desperate attempt by many men to become what they think the world will reward, even if it means abandoning who they really are. Let us go beneath the surface now, to the place where truth, however difficult, is the beginning of freedom. Narcissism is not self-love, it's self-abandonment. What if we've misunderstood narcissism all along? What if it isn't the overflow of pride we so often mock, but rather the echo of a boy who learned too early that being himself was not enough? We're told to see the narcissist as someone who loves himself excessively, who craves attention, who thrives on admiration. But beneath the polished surface and the rehearsed confidence lies a reality far more tragic. Narcissism is not born from too much self-love. It is born from the absence of it. The narcissistic man is not who he appears to be. He is not the laughter in the room or the certainty in his voice. He is not the accolades on his shelf or the perfect story he tells of his life. No, he is someone who has become a stranger to himself. At some point, maybe when he was 6 or 13 or 30, he internalized a message so deeply that it rewired his sense of being. Your feelings are too much. Your softness is weakness. You will be loved only when you perform. And so he began to disappear. He didn't disappear physically. In fact, he likely became more visible than ever. But what vanished was his real self. The self that cried at movies, that longed for safety, that once whispered dreams into the night hoping someone would hear. That version of him was buried, not because he wanted to, but because the world taught him it was dangerous to be anything other than invincible. And what took its place was a carefully constructed mask, one that knew exactly what to say, one that chased validation like oxygen, one that smiled for approval and stiffened at the thought of being known. He became the man others expected, strong, admired, untouchable. But at night, in silence, when the crowd had gone and the mirror no longer flattered, a terrible emptiness would return. Because admiration can't heal the ache of abandonment. And the narcissist is often a man who abandoned himself first to be accepted by others. He doesn't truly believe he is better than you. He's just terrified that if he isn't above you, he will be discarded. He doesn't chase attention because he's full of himself. He chases it because he's forgotten how to feel full without it. Everything he does, the image, the control, the charm, is a desperate attempt to outrun the quiet voice inside that still wonders if he is lovable when no one is clapping. And perhaps the saddest part is that few people ever see this. They only see the exterior and respond with admiration or resentment. But behind that exterior is often a man gasping for air, not because his ego is inflated, but because his soul is starving. He cannot stop performing because he doesn't know how to stop surviving. If you've ever loved a man like this, you know the ache of watching someone who seems to have everything yet remains unreachable. And if somehow you see yourself in this picture, hear this not as condemnation but as a call home. You were not created to live in the applause of others. You were not formed to be a mirror of what people want. You were made to be known deeply and completely, not because you are flawless, but because you are real. You don't need to keep hiding behind competence, charm, or control. There is more strength in being seen than in being admired. There is more power in truth than in perfection. And there is still time, no matter how long you've worn the mask, to remember who you were before the world told you to forget. And so begins the tragedy, when a man, no longer able to love himself from within, starts to build his identity from everything the world demands he must be. But what does it cost him to become that man? The answer lies in the armor he's forced to wear. False masculinity is armor, not identity. If narcissism is the absence of self-love, then false masculinity is the disguise a man wears to keep that absence hidden. It is not born from strength, it is born from fear. From the earliest years of boyhood, many men are handed a script that tells them what they must become to be accepted. Don't cry, don't feel, don't need, don't soften. Be tough, be dominant, be in control. The more pain you endure without flinching, the more man you are, and so begins the rehearsal. The tragedy is not that these men become too masculine, but that they become strangers to their own humanity. They silence the child within before he ever had a chance to speak. They confuse power with identity, aggression with leadership, and stoicism with maturity. What you see on the outside, the hard jaw, the cold logic, the relentless control, is not a reflection of who they are, but a wall built to protect who they were never allowed to be. It's easy to admire such men. They look put together. They speak with certainty. They lead without hesitation. But what you're admiring is not manhood, it's armor. And beneath armor, there is always a wound. You see, authentic masculinity is not loud. It doesn't need to dominate a room. It doesn't puff itself up to be seen. It simply is. It is rooted in quiet strength, the kind that doesn't have to prove itself because it's not afraid to be vulnerable. But for the narcissistic man, vulnerability is not just difficult, it's unthinkable. To feel is to risk unraveling the entire illusion he's built. And so the armor stays on. Even in the presence of those who love him most, the danger is that over time the man forgets he's wearing armor. He begins to believe that the version he crafted for survival is who he really is. He no longer knows the sound of his own voice, apart from applause. And tragically, those closest to him fall in love with a version of him that doesn't actually exist. The result is isolation, not just from others, but from himself. He lives inside an identity that was forged by fear and reinforced by performance, but never chosen by the soul. And it is here where the pain deepens, when a man starts to realize that what the world praises him for is not what he values, and what he needs most is the one thing he was told to never express. He longs for connection, but has trained himself to control. He desires to be known, but fears that once unmasked he will be unloved. So he doubles down, hardens, distracts, achieves, and yet he is no closer to peace. Many men die behind this armor, never realizing it was optional. But those who live, truly live, are those who dare to ask the harder question. What if I was never meant to be this hard? What if masculinity doesn't mean shutting down but opening up? What if strength is not the absence of emotion but the courage to feel it and still move forward? The armor may have protected him once, but it cannot love, it cannot heal, it cannot hold his children, comfort his wife, or restore his soul. Only truth can do that. And truth is never found in performance. It is found in the quiet place, where a man finally lays down his sword and asks, not who others want him to be, but who he was created to become. But beneath this armor lies a compass turned outward, not inward, a compass that no longer points to truth, but to other men, whose admiration becomes his map of worth. Obsession with other men reveals repressed fixation. There is a quiet truth hidden behind the armor of the narcissistic man, one that few dare to speak aloud because it unsettles the very framework of how we've been taught to understand manhood. While he may boast of strength and independence, while he may parade his dominance over others, what he often cannot confess, even to himself, is that he spends much of his inner life revolving around other men, not in ways that are always visible, and certainly not in ways he would categorize as desire, but in ways that reveal something far more complex and unspoken, a deep, repressed emotional fixation, rooted in comparison, admiration, and a desperate need for validation. The narcissistic man does not simply compete with other men, he measures his very existence by them. He notices how they walk into a room, how others respond to them, what they wear, how they speak, how much they earn, how they're respected, how they're feared. His mind, though cloaked in self-promotion, is often haunted by self-doubt that can only be quieted by outperforming or outshining those he sees as rivals. But the rivalry is not the sickness, it is the symptom. Beneath the competition is a form of mimicry, a psychological mirroring that often begins in childhood, when the boy, unable to be safe in his own identity, begins to craft one out of the traits he sees exalted in others. He starts to imitate the men who were never allowed to cry, the ones who seemed untouchable, the ones who were rewarded for their distance, not their nearness. Without realizing it, he begins to shape himself in their image, chasing not only approval but embodiment. And yet this imitation is never acknowledged. To admit that another man has power over his sense of self would crack the illusion of independence that the narcissist holds so tightly. So he pretends that the chase is about success or respect or masculine achievement, but it is not. It is about being enough in the eyes of men he both envies and emulates. And here is where the phrase psychologically gay finds its meaning. Not as a sexual orientation, but as an internal alignment of identity and energy around the same gender, often in distorted, suppressed, and unconscious ways. The narcissistic man is emotionally and psychologically wired to seek value, significance, and self-definition from men more than from women, not because of romance, but because it is men he fears disappointing, men he secretly longs to be seen by, and men who represent the unattainable standards he set for himself when he abandoned his real self. He is emotionally safer around men because male environments often ask for performance, not presence, camaraderie without confession, brotherhood without brokenness. Within these spaces, he is allowed to maintain the illusion. No one demands he feel deeply. No one confronts his need to be vulnerable. And so he remains connected but never known, close but never exposed. He learns to call this community, but it is more like proximity without intimacy. Ironically, it is this internal fixation on other men, this emotional dependency on their gaze, their recognition, their approval, that keeps him from forming genuine connection with women. Because the woman, in her intuitive brilliance, often sees beyond the performance. She senses the boy behind the man, and that terrifies him. He cannot allow himself to be known, because if she sees the truth, he fears she will walk away, or worse, stay but no longer admire him. And so, he returns to his loop, outshining other men, mirroring their success, chasing their envy, confusing attention for identity. But he is no more himself at the end of it than when he began, because no man finds himself by becoming someone else, and no man can ever be at peace when the soul he's running from lives in his own shadow. If you've ever watched a man burn with competition, drown in admiration, or shiver in the absence of male recognition, know this: he may not be proud, he may simply be lost. And the real healing will never come by beating other men at their own game, but by laying the game down altogether, not to surrender weakness, but to reclaim a self he was never allowed to be. And yet the irony deepens, for even as he revolves around the approval of men, he becomes increasingly unable to truly connect with women, especially the ones who dare to look beyond the mask. Emotional intimacy with women feels unsafe. For all his charm, his commanding presence, and his ability to make a woman feel seen, if only briefly, the narcissistic man struggles profoundly with real intimacy. He may pursue relationships with fervor, speak eloquently about love, and offer gestures that mimic closeness. But beneath it all lies a silent truth. Emotional intimacy is terrifying to him, not because he doesn't crave connection, but because being known would threaten the very mask that keeps him intact. You see, a woman, especially one attuned to the soul, becomes dangerous to the narcissistic man, not because she harms him, but because she reflects him. She reflects the inconsistencies, the emotional void, the aching humanity he has worked so hard to deny. Where other men might simply validate his strength or success, the woman reaches for something deeper, something he has long forgotten how to access. And in that reaching, she threatens to expose the fragile scaffolding of identity he has built on image, not essence. He cannot afford to be vulnerable with her, because vulnerability is a door he bolted shut years ago. It was in childhood, perhaps, when expressing emotion was met with punishment or silence. Or in adolescence, when sensitivity was mocked and tenderness was treated as weakness. By the time he enters into adult relationships, he is already fluent in the art of self-protection. To open his heart, even slightly, would feel like disarming himself in the middle of a battlefield. And so, instead of connecting, he performs. He becomes the attentive lover, the charismatic protector, the confident provider, roles that allow him to appear intimate without ever actually revealing himself. But as the relationship deepens, as the woman begins to ask for more than admiration, more than a performance, he begins to pull away. Not always physically, but emotionally. He may withdraw, stonewall, criticize, or even sabotage the connection. And all of it is rooted in the same fear: if you see the real me, you will not stay. What he fails to understand is that most women don't need perfection, they need presence. They are not asking him to have all the answers, but simply to be real. Yet to the narcissist, being real feels like being unarmed, and he cannot separate vulnerability from danger, so he returns to what he knows: control, distance, and image management. He may blame her for needing too much, accuse her of being emotional, or suggest that she's never satisfied. But in truth, he is projecting the disappointment he feels toward himself, the inability to meet his own need for connection in a way that doesn't cost him his persona. Over time, this cycle leaves the woman feeling alone in a relationship that appears full. She may question her own worth, wondering why love feels so empty in the presence of a man who once made her feel like everything. But the emptiness is not her fault. It is the space between who he is and who he pretends to be. And until he confronts that space, no amount of her loyalty, patience, or love will fill it. For the narcissistic man, the tragedy is not that he cannot love. It's that he never learned how to love without fear. He believes love will strip him of control, that closeness will diminish his power, that if he surrenders, he will disappear. What he doesn't yet see is that surrender is not the death of the self. It's the beginning of becoming whole. True intimacy is not a risk to the man who knows who he is, but to the narcissist, whose identity is built on admiration rather than authenticity. It feels like a threat he must resist at all costs. And so, the very connection he longs for becomes the thing he pushes away. Not because he wants to hurt her, but because he doesn't know how to stay unless he's being adored. Until he can stand before a woman without needing to impress her, until he can speak truth without calculating how it will be received, until he can allow himself to be seen in his weakness and not run, he will never truly love. Left alone in a relationship that once felt full, the woman begins to fade, and so does he. And in her absence, he turns to the one thing that has never betrayed him: the thrill of being admired. The addiction to admiration is a substitute for self-worth. At the heart of every narcissistic man lies a quiet dependency, a need more powerful than lust, more consuming than greed, and more invisible than either. It is the need to be admired, and not just occasionally or in moments of triumph, but constantly, like breath. Admiration is the fuel that keeps his false self alive, the mirror in which he checks for existence. Without it, he is not simply wounded, he is untethered, because admiration for him is not affirmation, it is survival. We live in a culture that rewards image more than integrity, and the narcissist has learned this game well. He curates himself to match expectations, adapts his words to suit the audience, and molds his behavior to earn applause. But the man doing all of this is not operating from self-love. He is functioning from emptiness. Praise becomes a drug, each compliment offering temporary relief from the inner void he never dares to face. And like any addict, the high wears off quickly, leaving him restless, hungry, and searching for more. He may appear self-assured, but watch how he bristles under criticism. Watch how quickly he shifts from charm to contempt the moment someone sees through him. That reaction is not arrogance, it is panic. Because criticism threatens to expose the truth that beneath the well-lit surface is a man who has built his identity entirely on the opinions of others. He doesn't know who he is apart from admiration. He doesn't know how to breathe when the crowd is silent. And here lies the greatest tragedy. Not only does this dependency deform his relationships, it also distorts his ability to receive real love. Because real love is not always applause. Real love speaks truth, holds space for failure, and challenges illusions. But to the narcissistic man, this kind of love feels foreign, even hostile. He misinterprets honesty as attack, vulnerability as manipulation, and emotional, so he retreats to what he knows: performance, validation, admiration. Even moments of seeming vulnerability are often carefully calculated to win sympathy or reinforce his image as evolved, sensitive, or spiritual. Everything becomes a transaction, even love. He begins to chase relationships, not for connection, but for confirmation. He wants to be seen not for who he is, but for how well he hides. And because of this, those who love him will always feel like they're loving someone who's never fully present, like trying to embrace smoke. No matter how close they get, there is always a distance. Because he's not with them, he's with the version of himself they reflect back to him. This addiction to admiration is not harmless. It costs him his authenticity. It costs him his peace. It costs him every chance to be loved for who he truly is, rather than who he pretends to be. And perhaps most painfully, it costs those around him the gift of being loved in return. Because when a man is constantly seeking mirrors, he stops being a mirror for others. He no longer sees their pain, their needs, or their worth, only what they reflect about him. He will climb ladders, command stages, win attention, even appear to have it all, but at night, in the quiet moments, he remains haunted by the same ache. If I stop impressing, will anyone stay? And that question, left unanswered for too long, becomes a kind of quiet torment, the kind that no applause can ever silence. The truth he needs is not another compliment. It is the realization that worth was never meant to be earned through the eyes of others. It was meant to be received from the one who made him, the one who called him before he ever did anything to deserve it. Until he turns toward that truth, until he lays down the exhausting burden of being admired and begins the sacred journey of being real, he will never know the rest his soul has been searching for. But what happens when admiration no longer numbs the ache? When the praise grows quiet and he's left with no one left to impress, that is where the journey of healing truly begins. Healing only begins when the mask falls. There is a sacred pain that comes not when a man is attacked, but when he can no longer hide from himself. It is not the pain of failure, but the ache of self-recognition, the moment when the applause fades, the distractions quiet, and he is left alone with the life he has built and the man he never became. For the narcissistic man, this moment does not arrive loudly. It slips in like a shadow after a long performance. It waits at the edge of his charm, his power, his social victories, and whispers the words that undo everything. This is not who you really are. And for the first time, he cannot argue, because deep down he knows. He knows that for years he's been playing a role, not a role assigned by love or truth, but one shaped by fear, expectation, and unhealed wounds. He knows that he has built his value on admiration, not acceptance, that his sense of self has always depended on how others respond, never on how deeply he is rooted. And when the applause stops, whether through heartbreak, betrayal, burnout, or just the weariness of pretending, he begins to hear the voice he once silenced. The voice of the boy who was never allowed to be real. That boy never wanted to be a god. He only wanted to be enough. But when softness was shamed and honesty was punished, he learned to survive by becoming what others applauded. He learned to speak with strength even when he was breaking, to lead when he wanted to rest, to dominate when he only longed to be held. And over time, that boy vanished under layers of performance, until the man who remained forgot there was ever someone beneath the mask. Healing does not begin with victory. It begins with surrender. Not to others, but to the truth. The man must stop striving to impress and start listening to the places within him that have gone ignored for too long. He must be willing to sit in the silence he has always feared, not because it is empty, but because it is honest. He must face the mirror, not to adjust his image, but to meet the parts of himself that have lived in exile. His grief, his regret, his longing to be more than admired. This is the hardest work he will ever do. It is easier to perform. It is safer to be applauded. But freedom never lives on the stage. It lives in the quiet, hidden places where a man finally asks, "What would it cost me to be known?" And if he dares to answer, he will discover that the cost is high, but the reward is everything. Because once the mask is removed, once he chooses truth over reputation, vulnerability over validation, presence over perfection, he will encounter something he has never truly known: peace. Not the peace that comes from being liked, but the peace that comes from being whole. Not the peace that depends on how others see him, but the kind that only comes when he finally sees himself and does not turn away. And in that moment, God meets him, not to condemn but to welcome, not to shame but to restore. Because God never fell in love with the version he pretended to be. He loved the soul behind the armor, the one who was wounded, the one who was afraid, the one who was worth saving, even before the first performance began. Because the truth is, no one was ever healed by being admired, but many have been saved by finally being real. And if the world had the courage to say it out loud, it would admit that what it truly longs for is not another impressive man, but a whole one. A man who doesn't need to dominate to feel powerful. A man who doesn't need to be envied to feel worthy. A man who can stand bare-souled before heaven and say, I no longer want to be seen. I want to be found. That man is not built in a boardroom or on a stage. He is born in silence. He emerges when a weary heart surrenders the need to impress and picks up the courage to be honest. And it is there, in that place where ego dies and soul speaks, that resurrection begins. Not the kind with trumpets or lights, but the kind that happens at the kitchen sink, in the car, in the dark of a lonely room, where a man whispers, God, I'm tired of pretending. And God, in his mercy, does not respond with rules or rebuke. He says only what every orphaned soul longs to hear, welcome home. So if today you find yourself weary from wearing masks, exhausted by applause that no longer fills you, or haunted by a voice that says you're only as valuable as your last achievement, hear this. You don't have to live this way. You were never designed to. There is more. And that more begins where the pretending ends.